Is it possible to make a watercolor pocket kit from materials you already have at home, spending no money at all? The short answer is yes, and in this video I'll show you exactly how I did it, all the way from idea to final product. My name is Alex, I'm a professional artist and I love painting outdoors, but it can be a lot to collect and pack art supplies for every single trip. I needed a small field kit that I could just grab whenever inspiration hit, so I could be out the door painting within minutes. I looked for watercolor field kits online, but couldn't find anything that worked for me. So then I thought, what if I made my own kit? What if I designed and made the exact product that I wanted to buy? And better yet, what if I made my own kit from materials I already had at home, spending no money at all? Now that sounded like a fun challenge. The first and biggest nut I had to crack was what specifically I was going to make the kit's outer casing out of. After going through my house looking for anything from plastic containers to cardboard boxes, I stumbled upon my first aid travel kit inside a drawer. It's a small, simple bag with a zipper, and that gave me an idea. Sewing is one of my primary skills, and I knew that I could easily make a bag like this one with the exact dimensions that I wanted. I just needed to find a way to reinforce the top and bottom lid so I could have my art supplies standing on a solid surface. In some of my past projects, I've used cardboard to reinforce things with great results. Like the sheets inside this pen case, for example. The difference with the watercolor kit was that, well, water was going to be involved, and that was not going to mix well with the cardboard. I could end up ruining my kit with a first use without a good solution to this problem. Luckily, I had just the thing, a whole bunch of oilcloth. That should do the trick. Now that I had a much clearer idea for how I was going to make the kit's outer casing, it was time to nail down the specifics by sketching up a design and making a pattern. In order to identify the ideal size for my kit, I had to start by considering the size of the tools I was going to carry in it. My brushes were the longest tools, going up to almost 18 centimeters, which meant that my kit had to be around the same length. For the depth, I estimated that 10 centimeters should be enough and proceeded to try the theory. I drew a rectangle of 18 times 10 centimeters in my sketchbook and arranged my tools on it just to make sure that everything would fit in the end. And it seemed like it would. I was ready to start working on the pattern. I found a scrap piece of pattern paper and sketched out the individual pieces on it. It was a pretty simple, straightforward pattern with only a few different pieces and just a tiny bit of math involved. Part of the idea for this project was to use scraps and to recycle things. I found this used up palette paper, for example, which had some really nice thick cardboard in the back. It would be perfect as a reinforcement for the lids. In terms of fabrics, I already knew that I was going to use oilcloth for the inside of the case, but for the outside, I wanted to use something different that was fairly water resistant and also easy to clean. Fake leather seemed like an ideal choice. Before I began sewing, I cut 2 pieces of cardboard of 18 times 10 centimeters. The idea was to sandwich the cardboard between the fake leather and the oilcloth and then glue everything together so that the individual layers wouldn't be able to move around. I suspected that if I didn't do it, it would cause me a lot of problems later on. While I waited for the glue to dry, I started working on the zipper and the section that would become the entire side of the bag. Zippers are actually really simple to make, especially this kind of zipper. You start by pinning and sewing the zipper to one strip first and then the other, and you attach both the outer and inner fabric at the same time. I was lucky enough to have a handful of zippers lying around from an old unfinished project. I was thrilled to finally make use of them. They were a bit longer than I needed, but I knew I could trim them off quite easily. The great thing about the oilcloth and the fake leather is that none of these fabrics fray, so I could completely skip the zigzagging. It made things a lot faster and easier. Once the zipper was attached to both strips of fabric, I wanted to hide the raw edges by covering them with some bias tape. It always makes the result look a lot more pleasing and professional. But this step is a purely aesthetic choice and entirely optional. I actually made a mistake right around here. I should have sewn one more seam on each side of the zipper to make sure that the edges in the back would stay flat. But I forgot to do it. It wasn't a disaster by any means. I was able to fix the issue later, and I'll show you how in just a bit. It just took a lot more time than it would have if I just remembered to do it at this stage. Next, it was time to create a closed loop by attaching the spine of the bag to the zipper piece. Once again, I attached the inner and outer fabric at the same time. If you're using a zipper that you intend to trim off later, like I am, now is the time to make sure that you pull the zipper head in so you don't accidentally close it off. Once I had a closed loop, including a zipper that could be opened and closed, it was time to attach the top and bottom lids. It's easy to do in theory, you just pin the fabric together and sew a regular seam all the way around, but in practice, it was a real challenge. The cardboard made it quite difficult to steer with a machine. Mistakes and ugly seams were simply a fact. But that's okay. As long as the lids are properly attached to the zipper loop, it's all good. I already knew that I was going to use some more of that bias tape here, which would hide the messy seams anyway. Attaching the second lid was even more tricky than attaching the first, but I wasn't about to give up. And finally, I had an awesome looking case. As for that mistake I mentioned earlier, I realized what I'd forgotten right about here, and I knew that this thing was not going back into the sewing machine. So what I did instead was pull out a regular good old needle and thread and stitch it by hand, all the way around, top and bottom. Yeah, you'll want to make sure you avoid this mistake yourself. Now that the case was done, I had a new challenge ahead of me. I needed to figure out exactly what I was going to do with the inside of the kit. I already had a water cup, which I got specifically for painting outside. As for the palette, I found a couple of metal lids of the perfect size from some empty jars in my kitchen. For the watercolors themselves, I was planning to use parts of an old set. 4 to 5 colors were enough. As a water source, I had this tiny spray bottle, which could easily fit somewhere in the top lid along with my pens and brushes. The question was just how? My primary concern was to make sure that things weren't going to tumble around and make a mess on the go. That meant that I needed to glue most, if not all, things in place and make sure that my tools had their own separate containers. For the pens and the water bottle, the solution was pretty obvious. I would make a couple of pen cases and attach them to the top lid. So that's what I did next. Sewing the pen cases was easy enough. I made the zipper section in the exact same way as I did for the kit bag, only this time I actually remembered to do those last couple of seams to press the edges of the fabric flat in the back. Next, I attached the bottom of the pen case, and finally I attached both ends. These, I realized, would not be possible to attach with my machine. At least it was going to be very difficult. So I pulled out that good old needle and thread again and attached them by hand. The pen cases were done and fit neatly inside the top lid. I was going to glue them in place just like the metal palettes. Which left me with one last problem to solve. How was I going to store my watercolors inside the kit without them tumbling around and making a mess? I wanted to be able to exchange and refill them in the future, so just gluing them in place was not an option. I chewed on the problem for a bit and finally had an idea. I had a bunch of cheap cork coasters from IKEA and figured I could use them to build a really good flexible container for my paints, which could also tolerate water. The container itself would then be glued to the kit. That way, the pans of paint would stay in place, but it would also be easy enough to exchange them at any point. It wasn't very complicated to make the container. I just measured the size of all the pieces, cut them out and glued them together. But just to make sure the paints wouldn't fall out, I also made a lid for the container. Everything was done and the only thing left to do was to glue everything in place. The water cup I decided not to glue to the kit. I wanted to be able to use it in other situations too, but until then it could live inside the kit. And here's the final product. A homemade watercolor field kit which cost absolutely nothing to make. It was a fun project in so many ways. For one, I just love figuring things out and solving complex problems. And it's such a great skill to have to be able to make practical things for yourself the exact way you want them. By the time this video comes out, I've actually already taken my kit out for a test run, and you can find that video right here. Overall, I'm really happy with how this kit turned out and how it was to work with it. Having this kit made it so much easier to go outside and draw, and it was just really nice having all of my art supplies in one place. I didn't have to worry about dropping or losing anything. I hope this video was useful and inspiring to you, and I'm curious to hear what you use when you draw outside. Do you have a field kit yourself? And if you don't have one, what's your outside drawing setup like? Let me know in the comments. And before you leave, give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. I share tips and tutorials for artists as well as my own creative journey. So go ahead and subscribe if that sounds like your thing. Stay creative and I'll see you in the next one.